Okay, welcome to part 2 of conformity and obedience. We already talked about the conformity part last time. Now we need to talk about the obedience section. Now, the biggest study, probably most famous study in all social psychology, is the Milgram study. We've already talked about this a little bit, but I think it's important to get more of a context of it. So I'm going to have you watch this film, and then we will discuss it. So, in that film, you watched the Milgram. We call it the Milgram experiment, but technically he didn't really manipulate any variables there. So later on it'll be an experiment, but the Milgram study is the most famous study specifically about obedience. In this case, there is an authority figure who is saying do this or do that. That makes it slightly different from ideas of compliance, where it's more of your choice to do it. It's not an order to do it. And it's not conformity because you're not trying to conform to what the authority figure is saying. You're obeying their order, right? So in this particular case, Milgram went up to several different psychiatrists and asked, all right, if we do this, what percent of the normal population, what percent of my participants will actually give all of the shocks? The experts predicted that only about 1% would. But what percent actually did give all the shocks? Two-thirds. Two-thirds of the people gave all of the shocks. Two-thirds of the people gave all of the shocks. Now, what was it about the situation that overwhelmed their dispositions? Do you remember we talked about Kerr-Levine's field theory? We talked about situation versus personality. Think about it. What is it about that situation that would make somebody who is a kind, nice, normal, genial person give all the shocks and essentially believe that they had just killed somebody else? What was it? Well, think about who is responsible. Who is responsible if the other person dies, for example, or is harmed? And in this particular case, it was very, very clear that the authority figure, the researcher, claimed the responsibility and said, hey, it's my responsibility. I'm the one in charge. You have to do this. I take full responsibility. And by doing that, it seemed to take away that idea of personal responsibility. In fact, some people even said, hey, I'm not going to be responsible for what happens. And then they kept on giving the shocks. The people didn't like going through that experiment, right? Now remember, in this case, the person who was being shocked is a Confederate. They weren't actually being shocked at all, right? It was a Confederate. It was all fake. So what was going on? In reality, what was going on was that people were being overwhelmed by the situation of having an authority figure telling them what to do. So the people gave the shock because they felt like number one, the authority figure was telling them to do that. It was a very strong situation. The person was right there. They had a lab coat on. They were very persuasive because this is Yale and that's how we do this. But we also see that the same thing happens when they replicated the study and did it in a not Yale situation, right? They did it in a different place that wasn't Yale University. It was just a research lab. There's something about the social norm of following the directions of authority figures that leads people to obey. And that situation can be very, very strong. There have been many different versions of the Milgram study that have been done. And what we're going to do is talk about several different iterations where they change certain things. So if you remember, the teacher is the actual participant. Okay, the participant is what's called the teacher. And they're supposed to give a punishment to the learner. Now, the learner is a Confederate. It's not really there, but the teacher doesn't know that. If we change this particular study so that we have something called a consenting peer. Okay. Under this situation, you have another participant with you. Again, this participant is just a Confederate, though, not a real participant. And this peer, this other teacher, right, is consenting and doesn't seem to have any trouble going through all the shocks. Guess what? You get near 100% compliance, right? If you see this graph right there, we're looking at about 90% compliance. This dotted line is the base rate, right? 2/3, about 2/3 of the people gave all the shocks in the normal experiment. But when you have somebody else, in this case it's a confederate, even though you don't know it is, but you think it's a peer who gives all the shocks, then the participants are much more likely to give all of the shocks. But what if that person, instead of saying, yeah, let's give all the shocks, says, no, I'm not going to do this? When you do that, you only get about 10% of the participants who give all of the shocks. The social situation is very strong. The social situation is very strong. The consenting peer makes the likelihood of giving the shocks much higher. The dissenting peer makes it much, much lower. If you have a dissenting authority figure, so here's how they do that. So instead of having one guy in a lab coat in the room, you have two guys in the lab coat in the room. One of the guys in the lab coat says, you know what, I think we should stop. And the other guy says, no, we got to keep going. If that's happening, then the participants, none of them gave all the shocks. None of them gave all the shocks. So it's not just having other people in the room saying no, that is important, but it also has to do with their social status. In this particular case, other researchers saying, hey, I don't think we should do it, was even more effective than having peers who said we shouldn't do it. Let's talk about proximity and emotional distance. So what you see right here are two different other versions. Now remember, this red line, this is the base rate. This is the base rate. Okay, in the normal experiment, without any changes, it's about 2/3. This has to do with how close the person getting shocked, the learner, was. Now remember, it's always a confederate. It's not actually a person getting real shocked. But what happens is, under this red line, the normal experiment, they were in a different room. If you take the learner and put them inside the same room as you, that leads to a lot less obedience. We're down here to about 40%. Okay. However, there's another version where, in order to give the shocks, the participant, the teacher, has to take the learner's hand and put it physically on a shock plate, give them the shock. When you have to do that, even though everything else is the same as the normal experiment, you get about 30% of the people who give all of the shocks. The social influence is important, but so is something called emotional distance. If somebody is right there in front of you, it's really much harder to do something that might harm them, something that somebody else might consider evil to them. Now, why is this important? Well, we do this emotional distancing to depersonalize someone. So, for example, when people are executed, they are often they often have a mask put on over their head. Now, you might think that's in order for them to, not have to see what's happening. But for an important reason, it's for the executioners to not feel the sympathy, empathy, and humanity of the person that they are executing. When there is depersonalization, when people aren't people, right? Instead of executing a person, you're executing kind of a nameless figure with a hood on, then it's much easier to do harmful things to that person. We also emotionally distance people, not just in executions, but these are pictures from Abu Ghraib prison back in the Iraq War. The Americans took over this infamous prison and took some prisoners themselves. These are Iraqi soldiers who became prisoners. Well, what did they do? They would put bags over their heads. They would strip them. They would make them not feel human. They would depersonalize them emotionally in this case. This brings us to an important point, and that is Zimbardo's prison study. There's another famous study called the Zimbardo's prison study. And this study was done by taking the Stanford psychology building, taking the basement of that and converting it into a prison. Zimbardo is the name of the researcher, and he acted like the warden. He randomly assigned participants to either be prisoners or guards. And they were going to do this for several days, for like a week. And what they found is that within just a couple of days, things got out of control. The guards started to fall into what they perceived to be their role of an authority figure. And they would do things like depersonalize the inmates, not necessarily by sticking a bag over their head, but by calling them by a number, by making them wear specific uniforms, by making them feel like less of a person. We do this with people or groups that we don't agree with. So, for example, during World War II, it was very common for Americans, not just American soldiers, to refer to Japanese people in very derogatory ways. Why? Because, and they would also portray them in cartoons and posters and other things, as well as Germans, but mostly more so um, Japanese people, uh, in order to dehumanize them, to make them feel other, to make them feel not like a person, so that it was easier for Americans to harm them, fight them, to kill them as part of the war effort. We depersonalize somebody in order to create that emotional distance. Have you ever been part of a mob? Now, I know mob, that's got a bad connotation, but have you ever been part of a group that was doing something that it shouldn't have done? If you have, then you've probably depersonalized yourself. And what that means is that if you are part of just a big group of people who's going out and doing things, then you have depersonalized yourself, become part of a big group. You have less uh, individual responsibility. You're de-individuated, is what we often say. This allows you to do things to other people and do things that you normally wouldn't do because you feel less individuated. You feel like you are just part of the group and it's the group that's doing this, not you. Okay, we need to talk about Sheridan and King. Sheridan King is a replication of the Milgram experiment, but this time people were worried that in the original study the participants knew that it wasn't real, and so they were just kind of go along. They weren't actually doing it. So Sheridan King said, "All right, let's do this then, and we are going to use a real puppy in a real cage that has real electricity on the bottom of it. And so the puppy is actually going to be shocked." So they had the participants were teachers and the dog was the learner. But this time the dog is in the room and the dog is actually receiving the shocks. So the questions we need to ask are, oh, so by the way, one thing that we need to mention is that the dogs were supposed to do a task, but remember the task is actually impossible. So when they're giving these shocks, this is kind of the volts, there's 30 switches. Um, when they're giving the shocks, it was obvious that the dog was feeling shocked. Now I know you can't read these very well, but as you get down there, the dog was actually, yelping and whimpering and jumping and trying to get away, right? So it's clear. It's clear that the dog is being shocked. No, you can't get around that. Okay? So remember, the task is impossible. The dog cannot complete the task. So the dog must be punished according to the rules of the study. So what I want you to guess is what percentage of the people, now in this case, the people are all students, right? They're all undergraduate students. In 1972, what proportion of the students actually gave all of the shocks to a puppy who they knew they were shocking? Do you think that males were more likely to give all the shocks or females were more likely to give all the shocks? Or was it equal? If you were there, would you have given all the shocks? Now, of course, people think that they're not going to give all the shocks. Of course not, right? Of course not. When we ask this question, almost everybody says no. But remember, the entire purpose of this is to realize that the situation is quite influential, right? The situation has more of an influence than we think it does. Here are the results of the study. Overall, 77% of the people, more than in Milgram, gave all the shocks to the puppy. And they knew that the puppy was being shocked. Now, the puppy didn't die, right? But they knew they were giving shocks to the puppy. There was a minority who refused to give any, but there's also a small group who lied. By lied, they're saying, oh, well, the dog did what they're supposed to do, and so I didn't give him a shock. Now remember, we know that this was an impossible task, so the dog didn't actually do this. We know that they were lying. They were lying in order to get out of shocking the puppy. When we split it by males and females, we found that 54% of the males gave all the shocks. 100% of the females gave all the shocks. Now, we don't need to get into this too much. I do think that 1972 is a different time and place, and I think that there's gender norms that are involved here. I think that that's probably true, and I think there's a good case to say that those norms have changed since 1972 as well. But what's interesting here is that you probably said that you would not give those shocks. I'm not saying that you're wrong. All I'm saying is that when the social situation is strong, we underestimate how influential it's going to be. An authority figure tends to be a very, very strong social situation and can overwhelm the disposition. By disposition, I'm talking about people's personalities. Nobody liked giving the shocks to the puppy, right? One way to think about this is, oh yeah, people like giving shocks to the puppy, that's why they did it. But we know that that's not the case. We know that that's not the case because we know that people complained. Some even cried. People didn't like to do it. The purpose here is to show that the social situation can be very strong. Now, is it all powerful? Will it make you do things that you would not normally do? Well, it might influence you to do things you might not normally do, but it doesn't mean it takes over your soul and makes you do stuff. We know that there are people in the original Milgram study, 1/3 of the people didn't give all the shocks, where 2/3 of the people did. There is a combination of your personality and the social situation, but don't underestimate the social situation. All right, thanks everybody.